Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist at John Jay College here in New York City. As we all attempt to grapple with the reality of the new administration, many of us turn to words, ideas, paradigms, and imagination, which we hope will lead to strategies and action that can resist and transform the reality of an American version of neo-fascism. In a recent column, New York Times columnist Charles Blow puts it this way: Trump's America is not America, not today's or tomorrow's, but yesterday's. Trump's America is brutal, perverse, regressive, insular, and afraid. There's no hope in it. There's no light in it. It is a vast expanse of darkness and desolation. Blow concludes by saying, if no one else is going to fight for American values, it falls to the American people themselves to do so. We agree. Words and definitions are important as we imagine and struggle toward progressive change in the face of the hate, anger, rage, greed, bullying, scapegoating, and state violence of this new administration. In today's show, we offer a powerful alternative narrative. Academics and activists refer to the term as structural violence. The psychiatrist Dr. James Gilligan, a frequent guest on this show, has defined it as the increased rates of death and disability suffered by those who occupy the bottom rungs of society, as contrasted with the relatively lower death rates experienced by those who are above them. These excess deaths are described as non-natural, and he attributes them to the stress, shame, and discrimination that results from lower status. Because it affects people differently in various social structures, it is very closely linked to social justice and social injustice. Our guest today is one of the leading scholars and activists in this exciting, relatively new field. Bandy Lee is a clinical professor of law and psychiatry at Yale University and is the editor of an important forthcoming 15-article series modeled after a global health studies course entitled Violence, Causes and Cures. It reviews the mechanisms that society has used in an attempt to stem violence. In particular, she examines the power of nonviolence and argues that the term being called social injustice or oppression should be called violence because this phenomenon comes from and can be corrected by human decisions rather than just natural causes. She demonstrates that nonviolent methods have brought down empires, toppled regimes, and effectuated long-lasting peace, and at a greater frequency historically than violent means. This all seems to be exactly the discussion we need to have these days. And Bandy will be talking about a particular example in her own personal life that will illustrate on a larger scale what structural violence is all about. So I'm very pleased to welcome Bandy back for her second visit to the Radical Imagination. Thank you so much, Bandy, for being here, and I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you, Jim, for having me back.
Well, start us off on this particular individual case that you're dealing with that illustrates this larger phenomenon you're calling structural violence.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you know, as a psychiatrist and a clinician, I always like to start with the personal experience, because whenever we have larger phenomena going on in society, it informs us a great deal also to think about the effects at the individual level. Just incidentally, I have come to experience an effect of the growing structural violence in our society.
Very disconcerting. isn't it? Hasn't
Yes,
it been? Yeah.
yes.
Really?
First time in my life, and never knew it would get to this point. But you hear about rent-stabilized tenants being driven out by their landlords, how the increasing rent in New York has made it harder and harder for people to find housing. There's growing homelessness, and even storefronts that small businesses find it harder and harder to get leases, even though they are able to pay the rent. And as you know, I live now in what has become the richest neighborhood in New York City, near Columbus Circle.
Which is right across from Donald Trump Plaza.
That's
there, right?
The International
Trump
Hotel.
Tower, International Hotel, right?
And so it's the newly rising area. It was one of the, it had among the cheaper rents earlier when I moved in, and now it has one of the highest rents, with the condos going at $95 million a piece.
95 million?
Yes, that's
In your building? Or nearby?
On the block, on the same
Wow.
block.
Okay.
So I live in a rental building.
Right.
And now, even though we are paying high rent, it's not rent stabilized, all of us are paying higher than usual rent and average rent in New York City. And we are being driven out in favor of corporate tenants. And as you know, corporations are considered individuals by
our Supreme Court.
yes, by very unreasonable scales.
Absolutely.
And so corporations can rent these apartments like individual tenants, but they pay much higher rent. They are able to, and they run them like hotels. So
And as investments.
as investments.
yeah.
So they're used for commercial purposes. Some of
Right.
them have tenants going in and out every other week at times, and so it really defeats the purpose of residential zoning and residential laws. But in effect, this building has managed to drive out its majority regular resident tenants to make it 85% corporate at this
Wow.
time.
And you're hanging in there.
And this just,
Yeah. So you're
I'm one of the
trying
few
to-
now.
One of the few. Wow.
I moved in not that long ago, 5 years ago, and now I'm one of the longest living tenants there. People who have lived there for decades have been driven out with very unhappy stories.
Such as?
And I'm experiencing it now too.
right.
You know that I recently lost my mother. So I came to have compassion for others who have lost their parents in ways I didn't before. And so I happened to have a friend, actually my mother's friend, who lost a parent, and he was in the process of losing his childhood home. His mother was going bankrupt, and so I invited him to stay at my place for just a couple months as a refuge before he has to go move in this very small apartment with his mother. Well, the building knows him because he was a tenant in the building before.
Okay.
He had an impeccable record.
He had been away from the building for a period of time.
For a couple of years.
A couple of years now.
Because
Okay.
he moved to a lower
Moved,
rent.
right.
Like a lot of people, when rent goes up 20% and you can no longer afford it, he was one of those who moved out to a lower rent residence. But even that he could no longer afford because of his family situation. And so I just invited him to stay a couple months. Well, the building, knowing him and knowing that he's not going to be profitable, that's the only reason I can imagine, proceeded to declare him an illegal sublet, even though I'm not taking any rent from him and staying in the same apartment at the same time.
And there was no sublet lease or anything?
No. In
So
fact,
he was just there.
I amply warned the building, told them he was coming, registered him properly, and still, knowing the situation and knowing that they could use some other legal tools to defend
or
their
non-legal,
case.
just any way.
Yes.
To
So
pressure you.
basically misuse of the law.
Right.
So they proceeded to give a notice of termination, and now we got the notice of eviction.
Wow.
So or court papers. And so so as you know, I work in the legal field. I'm a law-abiding citizen, never had anything like this in my life, but it gives me a personal experience of what people must undergo. There's no way to argue. The management office would not speak with me. They would not hear any explanation deliberately, because then it would hurt their case, of course, because
Could you send them certified letters?
Well, actually, I do have a plan, and there's no way that they will be able to get away with this.
Okay.
But this just highlights to you to what level. You don't have to be a rent stabilized, low rent paying tenant anymore. You could be paying the highest rent and now be targeted because of what economists call rent-seeking behavior. In most cases, it's not literally rent. In this case, it is. What rent-seeking behavior is that you have some assets, and you will use that assets or wealth or property to garner more profit and more benefit for yourself while not creating any new wealth for society. And so, so what you're doing is you're basically shunting wealth from those who do not have assets to yourself. So it's creating this increasing wealth and income gap in our society.
And vulnerability for more and more people.
Yes.
As it's reaching now.
Yes,
middle
to
class,
professionals,
upper
to upper middle class. And so less and less people are immune, and more the middle class is experiencing now what those in the lower classes have been hurting from for decades. Yes. Yeah. So I just wanted to use my example to illustrate the dynamics that are going on to increase structural violence in
So
our
this would
society.
be a good example of institutions, the structure of society.
And the exploitation of structures in order to increase inequality, which is our greatest form of structural violence in this day. In fact, it's a rapidly growing form of structural violence. And I'll tell you a bit of why I call it structural violence and why it is important to call it violence. It is because just like behavioral violence, real lives are at stake. In fact, structural violence kills more people than all forms of behavioral violence combined.
We were talking about homicide, suicide.
By behavioral violence, I'm talking about homicides, suicides, collective violence, wars, all of those combined.
Right. Domestic violence.
Terrorism, and
say that again for our audience. Structural violence.
Structural violence is the most lethal form of violence there is.
More people are killed through that.
More people are killed from structural violence.
10 times the number?
10 times. More than 10 times. The last time we measured behavioral violence, combining all the wars and murders and suicides, everything combined, is about 1.6 million deaths per year. Structural violence, on the other hand, is about 18 million excess deaths per year, deaths that would not have needed to have happened.
That could have been avoided.
That could have been avoided if we had more just structures, if these structures were not used to deprive people
of basic needs, like housing and
like
food,
housing and food and health care, nutrition.
Water.
Yes.
Incredible. Now this is worldwide.
This is worldwide.
You do this at Yale University, right?
So,
studies
as a violence specialist, I've been studying behavioral violence for a long time, of course, since I've been working in jails and prisons and trying to prevent violence. Well, if you work on preventing violence, preventing behavioral violence, eventually you will get to the point of working with structural violence, because it is also the most potent cause of all behavioral violence.
That's an extremely important point to again reiterate. So behavioral violence is ultimately, in most cases, would you say, caused by structural violence. This is something really new, isn't it? I mean, we don't hear that argument being made much at all in the academic world. I teach criminology, sociology. It isn't expressed.
It's
as
catching
it
on,
It's
finally
catching
on. Well, it started with the great Norwegian sociologist's seminal paper, as you probably know, Johan Galtung. He wrote a paper defining structural violence in 1969.
Right.
And then afterwards, their liberation theologians have caught on. James Gilligan, my dear mentor and colleague, has written articles for encyclopedias trying to highlight the issue. And most recently, Paul Farmer has made it more popular. The concept is catching on.
It's catching on. But as we know, the academic world
really must
takes its time.
Because as Galtung has said, if we just focus on the behavioral violence, which is really just the end point of a long process, then we're catching the small fish, but letting go the big, catching the small fry, letting go the big fish. And the big fish are the more enduring, the more pernicious, the more pervasive structural violence.
Kenneth Boulding, too, right?
Yes.
Is part of so the peace activists as well. Yeah, well, we'll get to it.
So,
so
you bring up an interesting point. If we may have an appearance of peace when we don't have wars going on, but structural violence makes it a very unstable form of peace. You know, the absence of war is not a comforting state when you have structural violence. In fact, it's like the biggest wars going on constantly on a daily basis, because all the deaths from the world wars would not be sufficient just to fill a few years worth of structural violence. So
so that's the first step, to bring this out to the open, to get the information out. I mean, that's an astounding number.
So why is structural violence growing? It's because of this type of rent-seeking behavior of using wealth to create more wealth and obstructing those who are working and actually producing wealth in society from getting benefits, getting a portion of the benefits.
But this is not, or is it? This is, how would you describe this? It's not purely a result of capitalism?
Well, it's capitalism that's driving it.
It's driving
it. It's the structure of capitalism that has become what some have
Global
called a
capitalism.
rentier capitalism, because it uses wealth to create more power, lobbying political structures, creating social conditions that will be advantageous for them against others. Because it's not creating any more new wealth, it will not trickle down. In fact, it will take away, because you are using power to collect more power. And those who are at the losing end of this dynamic are suffering greatly.
Even more, as inequality grows.
As inequality grows. So in this country we see those who are in the lower classes, wage has been stagnant, so they're actually making less money, working harder, and yet not able to rise in any way, because you cannot, without assets to begin with, you cannot create wealth.
And as a public health clinician too, you're seeing this in all kinds of ways: diseases,
Yes.
earlier deaths, mental illness, correct?
So actually life expectancy has been
expectancy.
decreasing for the lower classes of the US. There have been more suicides, more physical ailments, all related to stress. And
Heart disease, depression.
Yes, and growing
More
substance dependence and abuse, and all of this leading to greater numbers of death. Where it needed not have been if we did not have this current structure.
And again, it manifests itself in economic systems, political systems, cultural systems, psychologically.
So
right?
it plays out
and you
a
as
dynamic.
a psychiatrist, you see this and are drawing the links
Yes.
that I think few people
Right.
have done in the
So it
past.
has
That's why this is
psychological effects,
so
it has
exciting, yeah.
social effects.
Yeah.
We're seeing angrier and angrier people. Where are they coming from? It's because they're hurting, they're suffering greatly. And this is one of the reasons why structural violence gives rise to behavioral violence, because there's a greater sense of shame, greater sense of powerlessness. And when this becomes so severe, you lash out in anger, you become violent. Violence is nothing but a reaction formation, a defense mechanism against this profound feeling of powerlessness.
So the Freudian defense mechanism, reaction formation, for our audience, you do what? The opposite of what you...
You do opposite of what you feel.
Really feeling.
It's a bit like narcissism. The reason why narcissism is such a risk for violence is because you feel so you feel so small, you are so lacking in confidence that you need to exaggerate it. And if you cannot garner respect, you're going to go for the next proxy, which is fear, and you're going to become violent, you're going to exploit other people, you're going to instill fear in other people.
And the irony of ironies, you vote for someone who perhaps is one of the most incredible narcissists in history, whose psychological makeup is so fragile in a sense,
Yes.
and attracts the same sort of person in a sense,
Well,
right?
I
that
mean,
are feeling the anger and rage.
The reason
and
why
identifying with somebody who continues or is only going to make their
Yes.
own shame and humiliation worse. Or is that a...
Exactly. That's a very
Wow.
damaging cycle that's been going on for a while. The conservatives, or they become more reactionary now, have used rhetoric and basically
fear-based tactics, strategies.
used it as a political tactic to
Right.
abet this feeling to be voted into office, because there's a lot of identification, and then once they're voted into office, they do the opposite.
Do you think they're fairly conscious of that? Do you think
I think it has
the
been a political
politicians,
tactic so
some
far.
are more conscious than others, or just...
I think it has been a deliberate tactic to speak of a certain kind of rhetoric in order to be voted in, whereas they are not really serving the underclass, they've been serving the privileged. And so they're actually worsening the conditions that would make people more and more desperate for their rhetoric. But I think now it's no longer a tactic, because we have someone in office who actually shows dangerous signs of mental instability. And as you know, my professional ethics do not allow me to make a full assessment or to give a diagnosis without
actual face-to-face
personally doing a
interview.
full evaluation,
Full-
and
yeah.
that's absolutely true. I
Which
cannot come to any
ain't going to happen,
conclusions,
right? You're not going to get Donald Trump,
and certainly
unfortunately, in your office.
not get his consent to release it to the public.
Right.
But there is such a thing as what's called a physician's emergency certificate, which is when you see someone acting dangerously or showing signs of imminent danger because of psychiatric symptoms, then you actually have the authority as a psychiatrist, psychologist, someone who has been trained, to detain the person to allow for an evaluation.
To allow for an evaluation.
To allow for an evaluation.
And so the observation
so
can
it
occur.
may get to that point. I don't know if it will be possible for someone in so great a position, but in any other situation, he gets dangerously close to that point. And
then, of course, this would involve the legal system at
so,
some level.
So what is actually most concerning is that I no longer believe it's a tactic. There are signs of impulsivity and signs of true symptoms out of a mental compromise that leads to actions, and in that case it's no longer calculated. In that case, it is one cannot help oneself. One is
Really? So
rather out of control. So I think that's really what makes the situation more dangerous right now. But I'm merely saying this to point out how structural violence can lead to a dangerous situation in terms of actual violence. Whether it leads to wars, whether it leads to conditions that increase hate crime, increase interpersonal violence, increase the possibility of environmental damage from which we cannot return, nuclear war. All these are very real concerns and a possibility that would, as a result of structural violence.
So it's individuals operating within, in a sense, dysfunctional structures.
So
and the interaction here,
So
and achieving the power to impose their will in various dysfunctional ways.
So I would say that the current
Rationalizing
structure,
about it.
the current political structure, is a direct result of past and present structural violence that has created this very deprived, suffering, and angry underclass, and which is now resonating through larger and larger portions of society. We are going to see more of this unless structural violence is addressed. Well, the good news is that structural violence is not a natural phenomenon.
Right.
It's not inevitable. It is a result of choices made by human beings. So we can make the choice to correct the situation, to reduce the structural violence that is causing that.
If we're at the rational, logical level, to respond in that way.
Right.
But as
it
you were
requires
saying, not all
a healthy
enough ego, or right.
Populace to be able to opt for those choices. And it's true that when you have a lot of structural violence, then the populist society itself will not be as healthy. And just like any other human pathology, it spirals into greater and greater sickness. And
this is not just an American phenomenon.
no,
right?
it's a worldwide phenomenon.
I think it should be stressed. Worldwide.
It's actually more
transcends
pronounced.
cultures.
It's more pronounced worldwide, and that the disparity is growing rapidly. When the top 1% of the world owns as much as the bottom 99% of the world, this is globally, then it becomes
and
very concerning.
It's not part of our nature, right? We learn this. Where do these structures begin to develop, and how are they perpetuated?
So, returning to rent-seeking behavior, I mean, John Maynard Keynes, the economist, said in the 30s that rent-seeking methods are going to gradually disappear and go away because of the New Deal, and because society was becoming more and more enlightened, income was being evenly distributed.
More right.
evenly distributed.
Through government intervention.
Through government intervention and policies that have been chosen by the populace.
And pressured through protests and
Yes.
demonstrations and organizing.
Yes.
That's an important
So
part.
the healthier drive of society has helped
By the way,
us
we're
move.
taping this for our audience on February 1st, so that's, people have to get their rents in. Rent payments, and anyway, okay.
Yes.
Bad joke, okay.
Yes.
So, all right, so go on.
But
yeah,
mind you, rent seeking is not just seeking of rent, property
right,
rent.
of course.
It can be based on intellectual property, it can be based on technological property, patents, all these are included. So it's basically influencing the structure, using your assets to lobby, to influence politics, to influence social thinking, to benefit you without creating more benefit to society.
And talk about that, benefit you psychologically in what way? Psychiatrically? Speak as a psychiatrist.
Well, it actually doesn't.
What do you get from it? Doesn't, but
it doesn't really benefit
you think
you
it
because it benefits
is.
you monetarily, wealth-wise, in terms of income and wealth distribution. The reason why the gap is growing so rapidly and increasingly rapidly is because assets have been used to increase one's assets. Of course, that arises from the belief that that increasing this wealth will make you happier.
Right, that's what I was getting at. What does Trump and his psyche
and psychologically
is
benefit
getting
you
from that?
But it's actually untrue. As there is a great scholar from the UK, Richard Wilkinson, who has studied inequality for a long time in different societies, and he has shown that increases in inequality make societies less happy, and even the top that is benefiting from this unjust structure is not necessarily happier. In fact, these societies tend to have more suicides. What you see is
at the top
more suicides at the top. So if you have an unequal society, you may get more homicides at the bottom, but you get more suicides at the top. So different forms of violence affect different groups depending on the culture, so you really have to look at the different types of violence altogether. Certain regions may gear more toward wars, terrorism.
Externalization of rage.
Yes.
In your thinking, is Trump the sort of personality that would be, as I'm talking here, I can't see him come to the point where he's even thinking about suicide. He's so defended, so his rage would be more externalized, right, as a bully and militaristically.
Yes, usually it's,
usually is, yeah.
you talk about inwardly directed violence versus outwardly directed. It usually has a lot to do with shame versus guilt. He's capable of feeling a lot of shame, and he responds immediately to shame, but hasn't shown capacity for guilt.
And the wealth doesn't seem to bring him happiness. He seems to be, as Robert Merton, the sociologist, put it, insatiable. It's never enough. You're trying to fill this bottomless pit.
And that's usually what happens with the rent-seeking dynamic, that it doesn't stop, it actually hastens. And that's what we're seeing, that there's no end. Gandhi put it well, the world does not have enough for anyone's greed, but it has enough for everyone's need. So anyway, the world does not contain enough for anyone's greed, because greed is
never enough.
It's not a matter of things. It's actually a psychological.
And if you want to get somewhat more spiritual, which I know you are as well, it's an emptiness of the soul as well as the psyche. I mean,
yes, I look at the spiritual aspect as a more as a fulfillment of all psychological needs and evolving beyond. And
say that again. I want to understand that point.
Well, of course, it's not well studied by psychologists or psychiatrists, but I have studied spirituality through divinity studies because I considered it to be the farther end of the spectrum, going from the biological to psychological to spiritual. So when the basic biological needs are fulfilled, you can address a lot of the psychological needs, and then when those are fulfilled, you can move on to the spiritual needs. Of course, they also happen simultaneously.
But so you're implying that the spiritual needs do in fact transcend. You need satisfaction at the biological, psychological level, and then move on to the spiritual.
I guess I'm creating a hierarchy by evolution.
Okay.
But it does not imply that that it happens in that gradation. What I mean to say is that a state beyond simple health in the psyche would indicate a spiritual state. So
a connectedness to the larger, the awe and wonder of the world, one's creativity, one's role in that, and love. Is
yes,
that part of it?
yes.
Love of oneself, love of the other, love of nature, the beauty and mystery of life.
So love is the key need of human beings, regardless of who we are. We have evolved as social beings who need love more crucially than anything else. We know that infants who are well fed and given all basic needs may simply die if they're not given the touch and the embrace and the affection that love brings. So what are these people who are constantly seeking greater rent in order to fulfill this void? What do they really need? It's actually love. And
Valentine's Day is coming up. Maybe you send them a nice, lovely, love-filled Valentine's card. I don't think that's going to do the trick, but we get the point.
There's a lot of pathology that gets created if this level of unconditional love is not given in the early stages of life.
Right. So, what do we do with this cycle that seems to be getting worse and worse? What are the possible options here?
So, I actually like what Dr. Cornel West says, that love manifests in the social realm as justice. So if we could reduce some of the social structural violence that is going on in society, then more people will have a fulfillment of their needs, and there are many ways it can play out culturally, psychologically, and at the level of the parent-infant relationship, that eventually parents will be able to give more love, they will have less stress.
As they get more, and as the community gets more,
yes,
as you give to the community. And
so it actually has to happen at all levels. In violence prevention, we talk about the ecological model. So the individual is closely tied to relationship, which is closely tied to community, which is closely tied to society. You have to have prevention at all levels. You have to have love at all levels operating for an individual to grow up to be truly nonviolent.
And yet, this is a term that's hardly mentioned in our political world, certainly not in our economic world, or the academic world as a serious object of study. I mean, Cornell teaches the course on
Yes.
radical love, and actually we're going to have David Kim up at from Connecticut College is going to be, he's been on the show as well, and we're,
Excellent.
Cornell, David and Cornell taught the course, and we're going to have David here in a few weeks and talk more about this radical love, which is part of all kinds of belief traditions, right? And non-belief traditions.
It's
whether
the
it's
center of
Judaism,
spiritual
Buddhism.
traditions. It's
Right. Loving the other. And that can also, as you're saying, translate into political movements, which maybe we could talk a little about the idea of nonviolent political movements that can somehow raise people's consciousness.
So why
About
are
all this?
nonviolent movements powerful? It's because they derive from, well, what Gandhi called satyagraha, which is steadfastness to truth, holding steadfast to truth. So what he is referring to, in truth, is the Hindu concept or the Jain concept of love, of this basic spiritual existence, coexistence with all other living beings. And so, so you might say that nonviolence is not simply the absence of violence, but it is a drawing from this opposite power,
Energy.
opposite energy. Now, Hannah Arendt called power the opposite of violence. And
so to empower people.
so to derive
Through
your strength from true power, not the
power.
guise of power, which
Right,
is violence.
Right, okay.
We talked about reaction
A higher
formation.
power, if you will,
Yes,
okay, true
yes.
power.
Then you will be drawing on this spirituality, this state of mind, state of love, a state of mind that you can cultivate, but also is fostered by
Through social action,
through
or can be.
or it manifests as social action,
Manifest.
but more importantly, it is a state of mind.
State of mind, okay. And, okay, and we consider ourselves, America, right, a very religious country, and yet we're perpetuating such inequality, such violence around the world. What are we, 7 different wars in different places? I mean, what's the disconnect there? Again, we're not necessarily talking about religious sects here, but what is it about our state of morality, if you will, or ethics or religion that seems to be breeding a culture so anti what you're talking about here?
So
So pathological in a sense.
yes, so human beings are complex.
Yes,
And-
start with that, yeah. Very, yeah.
And our minds are deep. So if this state of mind of nonviolence, as we're calling it, does not start at a deep level, if the spirituality is not deeply rooted, then it can manifest as violence. It can actually be an excuse for
Early
violence.
childhood experiences are essential, where you're nurtured, you're loved, you get that first view of the world there, mother cares.
So that's how it happens
that-
at the intimate level.
Right.
But
Okay.
at a societal level, it really happens from a reduction of structural violence. So if you have a lot of structural violence present in society, you will have portions and pockets of truly nonviolent individuals who have truly been nurtured by their parents in spite of the larger structures. But if you look at society at larger scale, the proportions are inevitably going to be smaller. And so you cannot really predict very well with an individual whether someone is going to be violent or not, whether someone will escape the the afflictions of structural violence or not. But you can very predictably foresee for the whole society.
Or measure it a little more accurately through the statistics
Yes.
of the various structures.
In fact, Richard Wilkinson did
Right.
it for the UK as well as for the US, and his graphs have shown that violence rates, these were homicide levels, almost follow exactly the level of inequality in society.
Mhm.
So when inequality goes down, murder rates go down. When inequality goes up, murder rates go up. And he showed that over decades this held to be true. Now, Dr. Gilligan and I did an interesting study, really Dr. Gilligan's idea, to look at political parties and how they affect homicide and suicide rates. Well, it almost followed to a T, except for 2 presidents, for 110 years, that whenever Republicans were elected, homicide and suicide rates went up. Whenever a Democrat was elected, homicide and suicide rates went down, almost by the same amount as well. And the reason why the trend is not more obvious is because we've been alternating between the two. And Republicans inherit good economies, lower homicide rates, just as Trump is, and someone like Obama inherits a poor economy and increasing murder rates. And then they lower it, but we don't see it because we have not had continuous occupation by one party or another.
It can vary from state to state too.
Actually, the national level power
national
was
level
much
is
more striking. So
more
so what we
striking. Okay.
concluded is that it had to do with their, it was a direct result of their policies that favor either the populace or the privileged. And, but not just policies, because when we controlled for their policies on unemployment, on GDP growth, we still saw an effect. So that might be more the emotional rhetoric part.
So these are very important. So in your struggle against these greedy corporatists that are giving you an understanding of what so many other people, millions of people have gone through here, your strategy is what? How do we begin to fight back
So I
on
think
this?
we really have to all own this, that it's not just a select greedy group of people. I mean, they do have the power and they drive the structure, but we are complicit with it in a sense, in that we as a society collectively agree to it. People vote these individuals in, these groups in, and I
And
look
we
at
work in the structure and in the system that does perpetuate it,
yes,
or can,
and we accept it.
and becomes a moral issue, right? What are we going
We
to do
consider it
in the face of this?
inevitable because
Right.
it's very easy to accept structures as natural and inevitable because they're enduring and they've been around for a while.
Right.
But I really look at violence rates to be a barometer of a society's level of health. So when we have a lot of structural violence in a society, it's become an unhealthy society where everyone is losing, basically. Everyone will collectively be less healthy, less thriving, even those at the top. Even if it even though they're taking from everyone else and garnering it for themselves, I think that in itself is actually a pathological viewpoint.
But don't they rationalize it and
Of
say,
course they rationalize it.
we're doing this, we are protecting you, we're making things safer, we're going to open up these opportunities. Look at me, I'm very successful. I want to make you more successful. The
But
government, the regulations,
the methods
yeah.
Look at
Look
the
at the
methods they're
methods.
choosing.
Right.
It's to increase structural violence and to increase.
But this may not be at a fully conscious level.
Right.
And there's a certain justification for it that, in fact, we're doing the right thing. That, I mean, we play devil's advocate here with some of these people. Well, this has to be done. It's painful. I mean, we've had a police chief who argued with broken windows and as a policy. Well, we need to administer harsh medicine to the community. It's not necessarily their fault, but this will help them. That's sort of a public health model, using medical terms, right?
I think by now,
in a distorted way.
after the proliferation of prisons and all the money that
Right.
has gone into harsh measures, scared straight programs, punishment,
One would think we learn. You know.
that we now know it does not work. Human beings do not respond in that way. They are much more driven by positive reinforcement, by encouragement. Mind you, there are people who need to be restrained.
Right.
We see them all the time in psychiatry and society, and so containment is different than punishment. Hopefully we won't get people to the level where they need to be contained, and that actually has to start much earlier. So if we can get ourselves to a point where we can educate ourselves, we can learn to slowly dismantle some of the destructive structures and replace them with constructive structures, then this constructive energy, this human thriving, loving, this
Creativity,
this
will
will
build on itself.
this will naturally emerge.
But again, with this administration, we seem to be
We're going in the opposite
direction. And the role then of, as Charles Blow was saying, is up to the people. That's where it's at right now.
So immigration bans, Muslim
Right.
bans,
Yeah.
will not make us safer. We can be sure of that. It will create a ripple effect that will exacerbate the violence in society.
Do you think we need to go through even worse experiences through the harsh penalties before we, as a society, finally get it? As an individual may need
Well,
to. I mean, let's hope
thought-
not, but.
I thought when the country was in ashes, when the economy was
Right,
in the pits, that after the Bush era we would have learned. But the way that mental pathology works, we can rationalize anything, and we can create delusional systems for ourselves that will just continue to spiral us into destructive states. And so we really have to start now.
And so it could get worse, in a sense, as an individual, as you see in therapy, before they are willing to begin that change.
So we will create belief systems, we will lose insight, we will lose grounding in reality to the point where we really destroy ourselves, and that's,
Right, but
that's a linear progression.
and we just have a couple minutes, so we again have to, leave our audience with the message that,
Yes.
positive message that
So
you are
nonviolent struggles, constructive struggles, constructive structures in
identification
society.
and loving of the other.
And we can start small, we can start at the
Right.
individual level, whatever we can do. It has a ripple effect, as the ecological model will show, because we all belong to a larger ecology.
And that love energy, that nonviolent energy, can overcome that fear-based,
It
punitive.
it is a more
but
powerful force
it
because it's true power, not the guise of power, not reaction, which is violence. Violence is a reaction against a feeling of powerlessness. So that's why those who feel powerless are at such danger of violence. But true power does not need violence.
That is a great way to end this show. And as we talked about before, we are going to have you back and talk about nonviolence and passive resistance and transformation.
Well, I'm just starting to
we'll
study it as a violence scholar, but
well,
certainly.
Bandy, thank you so much. This has been terrific. It's been really instructive, enlightening. Really enjoyed having you here. I know our audience really appreciates it. And this is Jim Vrettos, once again, thanking you for watching us here on The Radical Imagination. We look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.